I'm Lea Sanchez. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm an attorney, and I'm originally from Deming, New Mexico. If we look at how fossil fuels were able to, how we were able to become so dependent on fossil fuels for so long, you can see where the federal government, for hundreds of years, really almost, have provided tax breaks and other financing incentives for coal, and there just hasn't been a commensurate investment in renewable energy development. And I think that's a huge obstacle, and one that sort of connects up to the second huge obstacle, I think, and that's the issue of sort of framing this discussion. I think too many people, from my observations here in New Mexico and nationally, have taken this on as a liberal issue, as a left issue. And while it is something that I think a lot of progressive groups find it important, I think it's something that we need to not assume that it's just a lefty issue or a liberal issue, but it's really about trying to help local communities, and it needs to sort of be reclaimed as a societal issue and not just a lefty issue. So I think the messaging is off on that, and the sooner we're able to talk to people in rural parts of the country, in traditional red, I guess, parts of the state and parts of the country, about why this is an important transition, I think that the sooner we'll be able to get a lot more of those incentives, public incentives and investment into that kind of development. Deming's an interesting community because it's a border town, and its main industry there is agriculture. The main just job producer and so forth. Well, agriculture and narcotics, really. Law enforcement is the other major thing going on down there. Border patrol. So there isn't. There's just not a lot for people to keep people in those areas long term. And so there's a lot of. It's a community that has a lot of retirees coming from all over the country. So it's sort of changing demographically a little bit. With people from other parts of the country. But ultimately, there's the idea of brain drain, which happens in a lot of parts of rural New Mexico. The young people leave because there's no jobs. And really the jobs don't go there. The Walmarts and other places don't go to these small towns because there's not enough people there to sustain that kind of an economy. So it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. And I think Deming is very much that way. And a lot of this messaging that I'm talking about just hasn't really reached the average voter in that community. And I think that if we're able to figure out how to emphasize the benefits of renewable energy and really sort of take a step back as it being a us versus them, oil development or natural resources as far as gas versus solar and wind, I think if we're able to talk to communities about why it's important for them to figure out how to harness this energy, I guess, that people have for this issue, and try to benefit their community, I think they'll take a much stronger interest in figuring it out. And I think up to now we just haven't, the progressive side, and certainly my organization, we're trying to figure out how to talk to the average person in a rural community, and I think Deming is a perfect example of an area we need to address further. I've found just from some of my political work in urban areas and youth organizing, I think one catalyst that tends to be lacking in Albuquerque that people really get when they're younger and part of maybe a university community is the issue of smart growth planning and transportation, like smart transportation, public transportation policies. And that's something that I think Albuquerque doesn't have enough of, because everybody sort of gets the idea of trying to have a more livable community that's walkable maybe, or biking options, but also that you don't have to drive your car everywhere, especially when gas is so expensive. And so I've found that in talking to certainly university groups and other young people, transportation smart growth planning is something that they get quite a bit, and they, it's real for them. And so I think that that's an area that we've tried to explore within NRDC on how to pitch a lot of these issues towards young people. But obviously it's hard to get them involved at all, and I think some of the efforts like what you're doing here and other efforts of like podcasts and things like that, using the internet as much as possible, I think is a huge opportunity that we need to continue to figure out how to use. There's a lot of potential to be able to employ people, especially in areas like weatherization, energy efficiency, insulation. It's not necessarily been an area that has received, again, a lot of public support as far as like tax credits and tax incentives until very recently. And so we really haven't, as a state and even as a city in Albuquerque or other parts, figured out how to ramp up the training and everything that's associated with that kind of installation. I think the demand is there. I think we have very bad housing stock, very old housing stock here in New Mexico that is badly in need of upgrades as far as energy efficiency. Public entities, the departments, the state government infrastructure that is supposed to administer these programs are reluctant to ramp it up because they think there isn't enough installers, and the installers are ready to go, but they haven't connected with the with the department. So somehow I think advocates and efforts like these, we need to figure out how to connect up with with all the moving parts so that we're able to transition. It's going to take a while, but I'm optimistic that we can get there. I would advise, if I were talking to a local government elected official, county manager or whatever, to make sure that they are well aware of all the different options out there as far as public financing. As far as what kind of incentives can they provide? What does the federal government provide? There's even ways you can use EPA funds for remediation of certain sites, things like that. So it should be a package of a range of financing options for the local government, as well as ensuring there needs to be a little bit more, almost like a private investor. There needs to be a little bit more investigation, due diligence going into that company to figure out, is this a real project? Like, do they actually have the financing in place? There's also a lot of good grassroots organizations in the state, like yours, that does a lot of good work, and you're able to build community and meet a lot of other people and try to just kind of, build a movement and be a part of that. Especially, I think, young people in rural parts of the state, if they can connect up with what's happening in the urban areas and become that catalyst for their community, I think that will make a huge difference in terms of changing opinion in those parts. And then the other thing I would say is just, be a more responsible person in general. Things like recycling and using water bottles instead of purchasing water makes a huge difference for the overall problem of climate change and just waste and things like that. So I would just encourage people to sort of make sure they walk the talk. I'm personally a lot more concerned these days, day to day, on the transmission issues that are going on, because transmission is one of those issues where even if you're able to get all the wind turbines and the large solar, concentrated solar fields or whatever, up and running, sited, everything that happens to that, if you don't have a way to deliver that electricity, that energy to the market, to where the demand is, then you're really not helping that community. You're not helping the overall energy crisis. So I think transmission, we have a very old transmission grid in this country. We don't have a national transmission policy. We're not where we should be compared to other technologies. And I think transmission takes 10 to 12 years to even get the ground broken on some of these, and some of these projects as they're moving through, it's going to be another 10 years before they're even able to be up and you're able to distribute. It's a huge problem. And there's impacts to the land, there's impacts to species, there's impact to landowners and to just your visual, the vista that you might have in a particular location. So I think it is a community and a statewide problem. But I would say that for me, that's kind of one of the biggest concerns that people don't think about in addressing this overall renewable energy problem or change. I think that the governor's office is actually trying to figure out how to emphasize more local distributed generation as well, and figuring out how that fits into everything. I think that there's also, though, a utility problem with that, because the distributed generation it isn't treated the same way as far as, it doesn't, I guess, have the same sort of impact on the bottom line of a utility and its shareholders that other renewable energy sources does. And until we can figure out how that recovery is different and make sure that the utilities don't have a disincentive to add more distributed generation to their overall plan, we're going to continue to have a problem with getting that really up off the ground in a massive way. And the interesting thing is, utilities are an important part of this entire discussion, both in terms of generating the electricity and the transmission portion of it and the delivery to homes. And I don't necessarily see them as an evil entity, but I think they're a necessary entity that we have to figure out how to deal with, because they just have some financial incentives and disincentives that could really derail some of these local distributed generation and other efforts. There's still issues of capacity, of reliability. I do think that there's a lot more potential to make this a widespread societal concern, and I think it is feasible. Right now it isn't. I mentioned the cost recovery issue. I think it is still a risk right now to do some renewable energy investment, or to do renewable energy development. And we need to have more public investment. We need to have more investment from the federal government, more investment from the state governments, and more overall support from local municipalities, because it's still an emerging technology. And we need to address the recovery the amount of recovery, even at the regulatory level, that utilities get for renewable energy, because it's still very costly to produce. But I think that as we invest more in it, as we get more information out there, and I think that's going to change, and it's going to become a lot more competitive. The federal government did a lot and continues to do a lot to provide incentives to develop fossil fuels. So I think that we need to have the same kind of commitment as a culture for solar and wind and geothermal and other things. And I think that will then change the overall model. I do think it's a long-term transition. It is cheaper to go with with coal-fired power plants, coal-generated electricity, because it's cheaper, but then we're incentivizing it through public subsidies and have been doing so for a long time. So if we took that away from that, redirected it to wind, we would see a change, a leveling off of that competitiveness. So I think that's something we should, overall as a society, try to figure out how to do.